ROALD DAHL ESIO TROT Part 2. Mr. Hoppy weighed Alfie on his own kitchen scales just to make sure that Mrs. Silver's figure of 13 ounces was correct. It was. Now, holding Alfie in one hand, he picked his way carefully through his huge collections of toys, and by when the burst ball had the same color shell as Alfie's, and secondly weighed exactly 2 ounces more. 2 ounces is not much. It is less than smallish hen's egg weight. But you see, the important thing in Mr. Hoppy's plan was make sure that the new tortoise was bigger than Alfie, but only a tiny bit bigger. The difference had to be so small that Mrs. Silver wouldn't notice it. From his vast collection, it was not difficult for Mr. Hoppy to find just the tortoise he wanted. He wanted just one, 15 ounces exactly on his kitchen scales, no more and no less. When he had got it, he put it on the kitchen table beside Alfie, and even he could have told that the one was bigger than the other. But it was bigger. It was bigger by 2 ounces. It was tortoise number 2. Mr. Hoppy took tortoise number 2 out onto the balcony and gripped it into the claws of his tortoise catcher. Then he lowered it onto Mr. Silver's balcony, right beside a nice fresh lettuce. Tortoise number 2 had never eaten tender, juicy lettuce leaf before. It had only had thick old cabbage lips. It loved the lettuce and started to chomping away as it was a great gusto. This followed a rather nervous 2 hours waiting for Mrs. Silver to return from work. Would she see any difference between the new tortoise and Alfie? It was going to be a tense moment. Out onto her balcony swept Mrs. Silver. "Alfie, my darling," she cried out. "Mommy's back. Have you missed me?" Mr. Hoppy, peering over his railing, but well hidden between 2 huge potted plants, held his breath. The new tortoise was still chomping away at the lettuce. "My, Alfie, you do seem hungry today," Mrs. Silver was saying. "It must be Mr. Hoppy's magic words I've been whispering to you." Mr. Hoppy watched as Mrs. Silver picked the tortoise and stroked his shell. Then she fished Mr. Hoppy's piece of paper out of her pocket, and holding the tortoise very close to her face, she whispered, reading from the paper, "ESIO TROT, tag racket, amok now, ESIO TROT, work boo, bad boo, toot boo, nip boo, work boo, loose boo, ergug, urjuk, but plug, top no tap, ESIO TROT, top no tap, tag no, I buck doop." Mr. Hoppy puffed his head out of the porridge and called out, "Good evening, Mrs. Silver. How is Alfie tonight?" "Oh, he's lovely," Mrs. Silver said, looking up and beaming. "And he's developing such an appetite. I've never seen him eat like this before. It must be the magic words." "You never know," Mr. Hoppy said darkly. "You never know." Mr. Hoppy waited 7 whole days before he made his next move. On the afternoon of the 7th day, when Mrs. Silver was at work, he lifted tortoise number 2 from the balcony below and brought it into his living room. Number 2 had weighed exactly 15 ounces, and now he must find one that weighed exactly 17 ounces, 2 ounces more. From his enormous collection, he easily found a 17-ounce tortoise, and once again he made sure the shells matched in color. Then he lowered tortoise number 3 on Mrs. Silver's balcony. As you will have guessed by now, Mr. Hoppy's secret was a very simple one. If a creature grows slowly enough, very, very slowly indeed, then you'll never notice it had grown at all, especially if you see it every day. It's the same with children. They are actually growing taller every week, but their mothers never notice it until they grow out of their clothes. Surely doesn't, Mr. Hoppy told himself. Don't hurry it. So this is how things went over the next 8 weeks. In the beginning, Alfie weighed 13 ounces. End of the first week, tortoise number 2 weighed 15 ounces. End of second week, tortoise number 3 weighed 17 ounces. End of third week, tortoise number 4 weighed 19 ounces. End of fourth week, tortoise number 5 weighed 21 ounces. And the fifth week, tortoise number 6 weighing 23 ounces. End of sixth week, tortoise number 7 weighed 25 ounces. End of seventh week, tortoise number 8 weighed 27 ounces. Always weighed with just 13 ounces. Tortoise number 8 with 27 ounces. Very slowly, only 7 weeks, Mrs. was pet had more than doubled in size, and the good lady hadn't noticed a thing. Even to Mr. Huffy, peering down over his railing, tortoise number 8 looked pretty big. It was amazing that Mrs. Silver had hardly noticed anything at all during the great operation. Only once she looked up and said, "You know, Mr. Huffy, I do believe he's getting a bit bigger. What do you think?" I can't see a lot of difference by myself," Mr. Huffy had answered casually. But now perhaps it was time to call a halt, and that evening Mr. Hoppy was just about to go out and suggest to Mrs. Silver that she ought to wait Alfie when a startled cry from the balcony below brought him outside fast. "Look!" Mrs. Silver was shouting. "Alfie's too big to get through the door of his little house. He must have grown enormously." "Wake him!" Mr. Hoppy ordered. Take him in and wake him quick." Mrs. Silver did just that, and in a hot minute she was back holding the tortoise in both hands and waving it above her head and shouting, "Guess what, Mr. Hoppy? Guess what? He weighs 27 ounces. He's twice as big as he was before." "Oh, you darling," she cried, stroking the tortoise. "Oh, you great, big, wonderful boy. Just look what clever Mr. Hoppy had done for you." Mr. Hoppy suddenly felt very brave. "Mrs. Silver," he asked, "do you think I could pop down to your balcony and hold Alfie myself?" "Why, of course you can," Mrs. Silver cried. "Come down at once." Mr. Hoppy rushed down the stairs, and Mrs. Silver opened the door to him. Together they went to the balcony. "Just look at him," Mrs. Silver said proudly. "Isn't he grand?" "He's a big good-sized tortoise now," Mr. Hoppy said. "And you did it," Mr. Silver cried. "You are a miracle man, you are indeed." "But what am I going to do about his house?" Mrs. Silver said. "He must have had a house to go into the night, but now he can't get through the door." They were standing at the balcony looking at the tortoise. He was trying to push his way into his house, but he was too big. "I shall have to enlarge the door," Mrs. Silver said. "Don't do that," Mr. Hoppy said. "You mustn't go shoving off such a pretty little house. After all, he only needs to be a tiny bit smaller, and he could get in easily." "How can he possibly get smaller?" Mrs. Silver said. "That's simple," Mr. Hoppy said. "Change the magic words. Instead of telling it to get bigger and bigger, tell him to get a bit smaller. But in tortoise language, of course. Will that work?" "Of course it'll work. Tell me exactly what I have to say, Mr. Hoppy." Mr. Hoppy got out a piece of paper and a pencil and wrote, "ESIO TROT, take a tip realms, "That do it, Mrs. Silver," he said, handing her the paper. I don't mind trying it, Mr. Silver said, but look here, I wouldn't want him to get a teacher's mom all over again, Mr. Hoppy. He won't, dear lady, he won't, Mr. Hoppy said. Say it only tonight and tomorrow morning, and you'll see what happens. We might be lucky. If it work, Mrs. Silver said, touching him softly in the arm, then you are the cleverest man alive. The next afternoon, as soon as Mrs. Silver had gone to work, Mr. Hoppy lifted the tortoise up from her balcony and carried it inside. All he had to do was now to find one and a shade smaller, so that it would just go through the door of the little house. He chose one and lowered in his tortoise catcher. Then, still roughing the tortoise, he tested to see it would go through the door. It wouldn't. He chose another. Again, he tested it. This one went through nicely. Good. He placed the tortoise in the middle of the balcony beside a nice piece of lettuce and went inside to await Mrs. Silver's homecoming. That evening, Mr. Hoppy was watching his plants on the balcony, and when suddenly he heard Mrs. Silver's shouts from below, shrill with excitement. "Mr. Hoppy, where are you?" she was shouting. "Just look at this." Mr. Hoppy popped his head over the railing and said, "What's up?" "Oh, Mr. Hoppy, it worked!" she was crying. "Your magic words have worked again on Hoppy. He can now get through the door of his little house. It's a miracle." "Can I come down and look?" Mr. Hoppy shouted back. "Come down at once, my dear man," Mrs. Silver answered. "Come down and see the wonders you have worked upon my darling Hoppy." Mr. Hoppy turned and ran from the balcony into the living room, jumping on tiptoe like a ballet dancer between the sea of the tortoise that covered the floor. He flung open his front door and blew down the stairs two at a time, and the love songs of 1,000 cupids ringing in his ears. "This is it," she whispered to himself under his breath. "The greatest moment of my life is coming now. I mustn't bish it. I mustn't bosh it. I must keep it very calm." When he was 3/4 way down to the stairs, he caught sight of Mrs. Silver already standing at the open door, waiting to welcome him with a huge smile on her face. She flung her arms around him and cried out, "You are the most wonderful man I ever met. You can do anything. Come in at once and let me make you a cup of tea. That's the very least of you deserve." Seated in a comfortable chair in Mrs. Silver's parlor, sipping his tea, Mr. Hoppy was all in a twitter. He looked at the lovely lady sitting opposite him and smiled at her. She smiled right back at him. That smile of hers was so warm and friendly, suddenly gave him the courage he needed, and he said, "Mrs. Silver, will you marry me?" "Why, Mr. Hoppy," she cried, "I don't think you will ever get round to ask me. Of course I'll marry you." Mr. Hoppy got rid of his teacup, and the two of them stood together and embraced warmly in the middle of the room. "It all due to Hoppy," Mrs. Silver said, slightly breathless. "Good old Hoppy," Mr. Hoppy said. "We'll keep him forever." The next afternoon, Mr. Hoppy took all his other tortoises back to the pet shops, and said they could have them for nothing. Then he cleaned up his living room, leaving not a leaf of cabbage, not a trace of tortoise. A few weeks later, Mrs. Silver became Mrs. Hoppy, and the two of them lived happily ever after. P.S. I accept you're wondering what happened to little Alfie, the first of them all. Well, he was about a week later on one of the pet shops by a small girl called Roberta Squibb, and he settled down in Roberta's garden. Every day she fed him lettuce and tomatoes, sloths, and crispy celery, and in the winters he hibernated in a box of dried leaves and a tool shed. That was a long time ago. Roberta had grown up and now is married and has 2 children of her own. She lives in another house, but Alpi is still with her, still in the much-loved family pet, and Roberta reckons that by now he must have been 30 years old. It had taken him all the time to grow twice his size he was when Mrs. Silver had him, but he made it in the end. Roald Dahl as the TROT. The end. Thanks for watching my video.